How do we even begin to understand this massive, complicated thing we call society? I mean, it shapes our lives every single day, but actually seeing how it all works, that can feel pretty much impossible. Well, in this explainer, we're basically handing you the user's guide.
So let's start with the big question, the one that sociologists have been debating for over 100 years. Are we just cogs in a giant machine, pushed around by big forces like the economy? Or is society something that we build from the ground up with every conversation, every interaction, every single day?
It turns out the answer to that question really depends on the lens you're using to look at it. So we're going to explore the two main tools in any sociologist's toolkit: the telescope for seeing that big sweeping picture, and the microscope for zooming way in on the details of our daily lives.
Okay, first let's grab the telescope. This is what we call the macro view. And from this angle, society has a life of its own, right? With these deep roots in the past, it's seen as this grand blueprint, this huge integrated system of structures that was here long before us, and hey, it'll be here long after we're gone.
Now, what's interesting is that even the people looking through that same telescope saw totally different things. For someone like Karl Marx, society was all about conflict, this constant class struggle that's the real engine of history. But for Emil Durkheim, it was more about function and order. He believes society creates us as individuals by teaching us all the shared rules and morals, what he called social facts, that kind of hold the whole thing together.
And another sociologist, Max Weber, just perfectly captured this feeling. He called capitalism an immense cosmos, an unalterable order. You can almost feel the weight in those words, can't you? It's the structure that's so huge, so powerful, it feels like a law of nature, something outside of us that we're just forced to live by.
But what if that's only half the story? It's time to put down the telescope for a minute and pick up the microscope. This is the micro view, and it argues that society isn't really out there at all. It's right here, in the space between all of us.
A real pioneer of this way of thinking was George Simmel. Now, he was working around the same time as Weber, but he took a completely different path. Instead of looking at huge economies or big historical forces, Simmel said, nope, the real action is in the small stuff. He argued that if you really want to understand society, you have to look at the basic patterns of how we interact. Things like conflict, cooperation, even the dynamic between a leader and a follower. For Simmel, society bubbles up from the ground, out of these millions of tiny daily encounters.
This micro-perspective shows us that even our own sense of self isn't created in some kind of vacuum. Charles Horton Cooley had this brilliant idea he called the looking glass self. Think about it for a second. Our identity is basically a reflection. First, we imagine how we look to other people. Then we imagine what they think of that, their judgment. And finally, we feel something because of it, like pride or maybe shame. Our entire sense of who we are is built through this constant social feedback loop.
All right, let's use an example that really drives home the power of this microscope view. We tend to think of something like gender as a pretty simple biological fact. You're born male, you're born female, and that's pretty much the end of the story, right?
Well, a really fascinating study from the 1950s just blew that idea right out of the water. A sociologist named Harold Garfinkel, who studied the hidden rules of everyday life, wrote about the case of Agnes. Born biologically male, Agnes lived her life as a woman. And to be accepted, she had to constantly, consciously learn and perform all the unwritten rules of being a woman. She had to accomplish her gender every single day. Her story revealed something profound, that gender isn't just something we are, it's something we do.
Okay, so this brings us to a really important question. We've got these two super powerful but honestly pretty contradictory views. The telescope shows us these giant structures that seem to control our lives. The microscope shows us creating our social world with every interaction. So which one is it? Which one's correct?
Well, the modern answer is you need both. In fact, some of the most exciting work in sociology today is all about trying to build a bridge between these two worlds, showing how the macro and the micro are just deeply connected.
And a really key idea for building that bridge comes from a sociologist named Norbert Elias, who gave us this concept of figurations. Think of a figuration like a dance, right? You can't understand the dance by only looking at the rules of the dance. That's the macro view. And you can't understand it by just watching one dancer all by themselves. That's the micro view. You have to see the whole pattern, the interweaving of all the dancers moving together. This idea helps us get out of that old trap of seeing the individual and society as two separate things that are always fighting each other.
And this, right here, is the key insight. The big structures we see through the telescope,
They're made of and held together by all those tiny interactions we see through the microscope. And at the exact same time, all those small interactions are shaped and limited by the larger structures. They're not separate forces, they're really just two sides of the same coin of human relationships.
Okay, so why does any of this actually matter outside of a sociology class? Because these lenses, the telescope and the microscope, they're incredibly powerful tools for making sense of the world we're all living in right now.
Let's just take social media for an example. The telescope lens, the macro view, helps us see it as this massive global system, an economic machine built for profit, a political tool that can shape elections, a force that creates new kinds of social inequality. But the microscope lens shows us something just as true. It shows social media as the stage for our daily lives, a place where we perform our identities, build communities, and create meaning together through simple things like a like, a share, or a comment. You absolutely need both lenses to get the full picture.
At the end of the day, these aren't just theories. They're a practical toolkit. They let you look at any part of your life, your job, your family, your social media feed, and start to see the hidden forces and the deeper meanings that are always at play.
So, I'll leave you with this question to think about. When you look at your own life, your choices, your successes, your struggles, which lens are you using? Are you seeing the big blueprint, the massive structures that shape your world, or are you focused on the small, moment-to-moment interactions that create it? Maybe the real secret is learning how to switch back and forth between them.